My paper deals with 60s experimental poetry. Book called Nollapiste, and I give you a little background of myself. I did my dissertation last October, and it dealt with experimental and procedural writing, mainly in Finland. It was written in Finnish, and very roughly what I mean with procedural writing, constraint writing, text generators, text machines, and the tradition of text collage, and the history of multilinear dynamic ergodic works, where some kind of action is needed from the reader. And Cortázar's Rayuela is sort of one example of, because the structure is multilinear. And finally, conceptual writing. But this book, Nollapiste, 0 degree in English, or 0.0, subtitled Poems, is really a weird book. It's a rather obscure publication from '64, and it was the only published book of the author, Finnish journalist and writer Osmo Jokinen. Yet this book is still surprisingly well known in Finland, and the reason is the fact that it consists mainly of empty pages. There's no words. There's the only words are in the title page. There's the subtitle and the publisher, and next spread there's a second edition or second printing and the information about the print house, and otherwise you can check that out. Otherwise all the pages are empty, except that there's a sort of a series of small graphic dots like that in the book, and that's the only content of the book. Well, reader has to give some kind of answer to the question, why does this book exist? Some kind of explanation to the book. What is its purpose? And why the subtitle Poems? The first intuitive explanations are probably these two. First, this is a joke or a literary gag or a hoax, or this must be a provocation, an attack against poetry. This argument would probably relate Nollapiste to Dadaism, and indeed the book has been called Neo-Dada, a term quite widely used in the 60s art scene, Neo-Dada. This interpretation, the placement of the work in a continuum started by the Dadaist group, would see the idea of Nollapiste as provocative, destructive act against poetry, an attempt to make poets or poetry as high art look ridiculous in the spirit of, say, Tristan Tzara. Well, the author had his own idea of the book's idea, so to speak. He said in an interview that it is not bluff, it's not an attack against poetry or an attempt to destroy it. And he also said that this is a serious book, an attempt to activate readers. At the time of its release, the book caused wondering, and it was often also a laughingstock. You know, I could be a poet too if this will do. Or have you joined the Writers' Union? On the other hand, 2 newspaper reviews in total were written in the 60s, and they are not as stupid as you might think. They kind of seized the idea of seriousness of this book, and the idea of extreme statement, and its connections to historical avant-garde. Decades later in Finland, the book has been called an avant-garde classic and a cult book. And in 2004, in the Netherlands, the book was translated in Dutch as Nullpunt. Well, I believe that the Dadaism is not a relevant predecessor to this book. I would argue that Nullpunt has several other connections to avant-garde or experimental art movements, some of them contemporaries of the 60s, some later. It is obvious, one obvious relative is the European tradition of blank novels, also known as roman blanc, of which one example is Le Loi de Pure, Isidore Isou, which quite interestingly was released 1 year before Nollapiste in '63. Whether or not Jokinen was aware of this book, it's a mystery. Some other, perhaps less obvious international movements of experimental art that could be interesting and relevant in this case are concrete poetry, very lively international movement in the 60s, as well as book art, or the tradition of experimental book objects, also called as artists' books. I see this book context rather important when thinking of the book printing process and letterpress of that age, 60s, long before the digital printing and print on demand, which makes printing so light, quick, easy, and inexpensive. Back in the 60s, printing surfaces and typesetting were done in metal, so there was really a heavy machinery behind every printed book. The effect and idea of Nollapiste is closely connected to this reality of the production technologies. The fact that this heavy machinery was launched for nothing creates a disturbing paradox that is an essential component to this book. Well, very obvious predecessor is John Cage and his musical score, including Only Silence, 4 minutes 33 seconds from the year 52. When we look at the score without any notes, we really see how close these works are. Just like this composition, Nollapiste is also divided in units or departments, like a conventional book of poetry. There's time units. It says 80 sec here. Both works are empty channels where the actual content is missing, letting something else to come through. I would say that this something else in Nollapiste's case is different questions and concepts, like book, printing, poetry, writing, reading, and so on, and the obligation to think these concepts. This kind of replaces the temporal act of reading, thinking. Also, one musical analogy that could be relevant in the temporal aspects. If you think of the graphic dots of the book, is the musical concept of or notion of rest, which means pause, hiatus, interlude, caesura, regulated silence, and this sign means double whole rest, kaksoiskokotauko in Finnish. And then conceptual art is quite clear predecessor also, and the Cage's work is an example and forerunner of this approach, later to be called conceptual art, which started to advance in American galleries at the same time Nollapiste was released. This is really a vast area, but in short, conceptual art took a critical stance and challenged, firstly, art as unique object and unique expression. Secondly, the role of the artist. Thirdly, it was critique against art institutions and the role of audience. And there was also a very textual and semantic dimension to conceptual art. They used writing very much. In conceptual art, the idea behind the work is more important than the object of art in the traditional sense and its aesthetic values. And Saul Levitt said, who was one of the prominent figures of conceptual art, said that the conceptual artwork is good if the idea is good. We can easily see that Nollapiste clearly relates to these all of these maxims that I just said. It was conceptual art before the term was internationally established. Same can be said of its most recent literary version, to contemporary international movement of conceptual writing, a term coined by Greg Dworkin. And to conclude, constraint writing refers to French group Oulipo, Ouvroir de littérature potentielle, and its politics. Constraint being the most single important concept of the group. Oulipo was established in 1960, still going strong. It was kind of an anti-surrealist movement, so there's this kind of link to avant-garde movements in history. Instead, the unconscious or total freedom worshipped by André Breton and the surrealists. Oulipians introduced strict rules, formal patterns, mathematical restrictions to poetry and literary creativity. The lipogram, omission or denial of certain letters, is a good example of constraint. Georges Perec's novel Without Letter E is the most famous and skillful example of this. Like most of the constraints, lipograms control the expression by ruling something out. Constraint is always conscious, calculated, and intentional. So there is an obvious meta level to every constraint. Questions on the limits and significance of limitation, elimination, limits of limitation, absence, and not writing. Constraint makes writing self-aware. It is a kind of a reflexive loop that loops writing back to itself. This means that constraint is not just an empty trick, poetic acrobatics, or literary masturbation. Perec's novel and its readings and interpretations prove on the contrary. In La Disparition, tragic themes of loss, death, and Holocaust are embedded to Perec's constraint, the lipogram, when he cannot use, for examples, the French words for mother, father, family, and so on. To quote Baron, Warren Mott, American volleyball expert, absence of a sign is a sign of absence. So, in this perspective of poetic limitation and not writing, we can see Nollapiste as an early, extreme and conceptual form of writing under constraint. This also gives reason to state, as a closing remark, that all constraint writing is conceptual writing. Thank you.